There are at least a couple different ways to generate the graph of this piecewise function. I'll go ahead and make a table of values. Now I can see in the definition of the function that something changes here around x equals 0. When x is greater than or equal to 0, I'm using that first piece of the function. When x is less than 0, I'm using the second piece. So I want to make sure and pick values for x on both sides of that change. So since that occurs at 0, I'm just going to go ahead and put that somewhere in the middle of the table, pick a couple numbers on either side. So we'd plug a -2 in for x and a -1. I'm going to go ahead and put 0 in here twice, so I'll explain in a second, and then pick a couple other things on the other side. Okay, so when x is -2, -2 is less than 0, so that we fall in this category here. X is less than 0, so that means I have to use this equation for the function. So when x is -2, we're plugging it in there for x. We're plugging a -2 here in the x minus 2. So we get -2 minus 2, which is -4. X is -1, same thing, that's less than 0, so we're plugging it into the x minus 2 equation. So we get -1 minus 2, which is -3. Now when we get to the 0, technically I'd have to use the top piece of this function because it says to use that part when x is greater than or equal to 0. So when x equals 0, I'm up here in this top piece. But I'm going to go ahead and plug this 0 into that bottom piece still so that I know where to stop this segment of the graph. So I'm putting that kind of dashed line around it to remind me this point itself is not part of the graph, but I have to go up to and just not include this point. So we're going to represent that on the graph using an open circle. So I'm going to go ahead and plug the 0 into that bottom piece and get -2. So let me go ahead and graph this part. -2, -4, -1, -3, and then that 0, -2, that's going to get an open circle. And so the reason for that is that it says x is less than 0. I'm using this x minus 2 piece. So I can't just go down to -1 though and say, oh, well, if x is less than 0, that must mean we go down to -1, because then I'd be leaving out all of those numbers in between -1 and 0, like -1/2 and -1/4 and -2/3 and things like that. So those need to be part of this graph so we get really, really close to 0 and just not include it, and we show that using an open circle. So this piece of the graph continues on that way in that direction. So we want to make sure and continue it there on that end with an arrow, but have our end point there with an open circle. It stops there. So from then on, so now when I get back to my table, when I plug a 0 in for x, I'll be using that top piece, and there's no x variable to plug anything in for, so the y coordinate's always just 3. So same thing when x is 1, the y coordinate would be 3. When x is 2, same thing. We land in that top piece. 2 is greater than or equal to 0, and so our y coordinate is 3. So I have the point 0, 3, 1, 3, and 2, 3. So again, that 0, 3, that is an endpoint. The graph is not going to extend to the left beyond that point. It is going to extend to the right forever, but it stops there at that point 0, 3 on the left.